So I'm Dekila. I come from a background of biodiversity conservation. I worked for the World Wildlife Fund for 14 years. And somewhere in the middle of that work, I fell into working with religious leaders, with faith leaders and culture keepers of indigenous traditions, and had this big aha moment. This was about now 15 years ago in 2008. I sort of suddenly realized that was the missing piece. And realized that faith leaders could speak to members of populations that scientists and NGOs and governments couldn't reach. And so I ended up creating a program called Sacred Earth at WWF. And I ended up working all around the world with different religious communities and basically trying to further conservation and climate goals. And it was really successful, and in the engagement with faith leaders, I kept getting requests that they receive more than the kind of training we were providing, that we were, being an NGO, were very specific to mission, and they did not see the point of having a conversation on water that did not include pollution, and I would have to say, that's out of my priority list. And so after some time, this tension between what the community wanted and what I was able to provide drove me to create the prototype for LOCA at Yale, and that was called YETI, which is still, I think, the best title I've ever come up with, the Yale Environmental Training Initiative for Faith Leaders. And once I created that prototype, I really wanted to find a space which was neutral, where we could bring faith leaders and they did not feel unsafe, which was some of the information I was receiving from faith leaders. And UW-Madison, being a public university in the Midwest, it was just a perfect fit. I was invited here by several people you will probably know at UW-Madison, Richie Davidson, Dean Paul Robbins at Nelson, and so on. So when I came in from the very beginning, I felt really lucky because I had a cross-campus program and I didn't have to work for it. It was there for me. And so when we designed LOCA Initiative, we launched in 2019. This is the group of people that were involved in the launch. We came together from really different fields. So we had psychology, neuroscience, sustainability, biodiversity conservation, but we also had religion and culture and women's rights and all of these different communities coming together to create this program. And then we had 20 faith leaders and indigenous leaders there. So they were the ones who were really deciding what LOCA should look like. So it's been community-based from the very beginning, which is why our vision is as it is. So our vision is that inner community and planetary resilience are interdependent. We cannot achieve any one of these goals alone. We have to be working on all three. And I have all kinds of transactional reasons why, if I'm speaking to a very more conservative conservationist group, usually I'll talk about behavior change, that we need to understand what's happening to people mentally and emotionally if we really want to see rapid behavior change. But I feel like with this group, I know it's very mixed, I feel like I can kind of jump over that a little bit. So in terms of the activity streams that we've created, based on that vision and the fact that I work with faith leaders, I feel like there's this weird, can you still hear me if I keep it here? Okay, that might be better with the feed. So we have capacity building where we do close hand-holding with our partners, and the criteria for who we work with in the faith and indigenous community are people who've been left out of the mainstream climate and environmental movements. So I work with evangelicals. I work with indigenous leaders here in Wisconsin, so we work with several tribal elders and culture keepers. And I work with Tibetan Buddhists in the Himalayas. And so we have very distinct stakeholder groups that we work with and build capacity with. And then we come together and co-design what that project should look like. So I'll give you a couple of examples. Of course, we do public engagement and outreach. We couldn't be at a public university and not do this, so a lot of our work actually goes into that. But then the third piece that Christy is going to talk about more is that we're working basically to provide the kind of resources that people ask us for, which is especially around inner resilience building. So there is a lot of information out there about community resilience. There's a lot of information out there about ecological resilience. But when it comes to inner resilience, there's sort of this big gap in the field. And a lot of what LOCA is doing right now with the Center for Healthy Minds is trying to fill this gap. So Christy and I will talk about this more. What does the capacity building work look like? So the project I mentioned with the evangelicals, it's called Creation at the Crossroads. Our process and strategy is very simple, it's very linear. We bring in roughly 15 to 20 evangelical preachers from around the United States to Madison in a closed-door setting for 5 days every September. It's at Holy Wisdom usually, and we sign the Chatham House rules when we come in, so nobody knows who these people are. We don't ever talk about it, we don't broadcast it. They self-select, they apply for the process. They are arranged in terms of their political views. We have had Trump voters in there. We've had all kinds of people in there, from all the way from liberal to conservative. And we have a dialogue with UW scientists on environmental and climate science. So it's 5 days. And through the process, some of the things that we work on, so we always have a conflict mediator in the room. We have a conflict resolutionist who's fantastic, and also an evangelical, which really helps. Sometimes we have walkouts. Sometimes you would be surprised, it's the scientists who do the walkouts. But essentially, the commitment that everybody makes is to stay in dialogue. And we have a really great rate of success. About 75% of the people that attend end up staying with us throughout the year and end up designing projects for their churches and their congregations. So we stay with them for a year, and then we begin with a new congregation, with a new cohort of evangelical preachers. So there are obvious reasons why. This is probably the most significant political voting bloc that we can think of when it comes to climate and environmental policy. We really need attitudes to shift. We need to engage with the communities that don't agree with us scientifically. We cannot afford to and pretend like they do not exist, which has been the last 20 years of the environmental and the climate movement. The other community and the other project I wanted to mention, which is really dear to my heart, being Bhutia from the Himalayas, is Sacred Wisdom, Sacred Earth. So we, in 2021, we ended up having an event called Sacred Wisdom, Sacred Earth, which was indigenous-led only, by which I mean every topic. So we had, all the environmental and climate topics you can think of. Every single speaker and moderator was indigenous. And out of that emerged this real discussion and dialogue among the elders, especially who were involved, that we create resources that really are meant for indigenous youth all around the world, that really focus on indigenous resilience as a concept. That basically what they want is that youth, especially youth who have in some sense stepped away from the elders and the community, feel that they are connected to community and to communal wisdom. And so so we launched this project, and we stopped filming actually. We filmed all of this year and last year, and this is the teaser for the documentary.
The earth is not going in a good direction, and we as Indigenous people already know that. And I just wanted to add some perspective as an Indigenous person, because it's so important, the values that we have and the values that we hold, to share them and help as much as we can, because this is our Mother Earth.
There's a major difference for a young mind to really think about, because when they grow up, they're told, you can be anything you want. Pull yourself up by your bootstraps. You are in control of your future. That was a very different message. When I grew up, it was, we are responsible to each other. We're responsible for each other. When one comes up, we all come up. We need to protect things. It wasn't I or you in particular. It was all of us. This is a we thing that's happening.
We understand things. Everything's connected. Everything's related. This reservation, we don't own it. We're caretakers of it. And it's not our decision so much as you got to think systems-wide out of this whole reservation. And the animals that live here and that water that's alive and birds, everything. So you have to understand whatever that trade-off is, it can't just be for people and for humans.
The incredible thing is, in this moment, right now, people are willing to hear us. And having access to each other and sharing knowledge in safe spaces, knowing that that knowledge will be respected and not mistreated, but highly honored when you speak about it. It's standing in solidarity with other First Nations and saying that we're able to share resources, that we're stronger together. It's time. It's just time for us to do it.
So that is the second project I thought I'd share. And then the third project, which is really going to be the main focus of today, is this project, Resilience in the Anthropocene. So once we knew that we were focusing on inner community and planetary resilience, our first step was to bring all the researchers we knew in these fields together. So this was held last year, August 8th to 10th. You can find all of the talks. You just have to go to redasummit.org. You'll find everything you need. It was 3 days of dialogue between researchers, experts, community leaders, contemplative practice experts, so people coming in to talk about psychological, emotional, and spiritual resilience as well. And so what emerged from this was two things that LOCA committed to do. The first is, we're very busy in the weeds right now with it, is we are creating a 4-course certificate program on edX. It's going to launch this May, and it essentially is going to help people, so it's going to be 4 courses. One is the overview, second is all about the environmental and climate issues, third is about psychology and the neuroscience of understanding why your emotions matter and how do you regulate them, how do you build your resilience for what is to come, which is essentially we're in a time of collapse, right? And then finally bringing it all together with contemplative practices. The course is going to platform 15 different contemplative practices from 3 different wisdom traditions. So you have the mindfulness Buddhism group, of course. You have somatics, which is really physical movement as a way of regulating your emotions. And then what is coming from the indigenous traditions, which is very much around nature-based, land-based healing methods. So we're using very deliberately these 3 wisdom traditions, partly because the research is there, and partly because we know this works. The rest of it might come along over the years, but this is what we're working with right now. And then Christy and I have kicked off a research program basically to look at the gaps here. So I'm just going to take a second to talk about resilience, because resilience as a word can be really loaded. If you are marginalized, this is a difficult word because we don't have a choice. We have to be resilient because life is so hard, systemically made difficult for us. So this is a loaded word, especially for BIPOC folks. But the reason why we decided to pick resilience is because, first of all, it means the same thing in different fields, which is rare. For those of you who do multidisciplinary work, you know this never happens. But secondly, the implication of resilience is something really important when we are in the time we're in with ecological and climate collapse, which is things do not go back to the way things were. Our best case scenario is not we get to go back to the 80s. It is what it is. Our best case scenario is that we have the resilience to adapt to things as they are and as they will be. And this is really necessary for the work that LOCA is invested in. The reason why I wanted to work on mental resilience and emotional resilience is actually very personal. So like I mentioned, I'm Bhutia, I come from the Himalayas. My region is very impacted by climate right now and other environmental issues as well. We just had a flood in my home state last year that was predicted for 20 years by every glaciologist I know, every climate scientist I know, every freshwater expert I know has been predicting this flood. And the flood happened. Hundreds of people lost their lives, thousands of people's lives are upended, and one of the biggest frustrations for us is the mental trauma in the community, which could be maybe not avoided, but which could have been helped, right? So it's very personal to me that we address the mental trauma that exists in vulnerable communities in the most impacted places, which is the global south, which is Black, Indigenous, people of color, right? Which is poor people here in the United States. We know we have a class system. We've been so uncomfortable to talk about it at UW, you know? So there are all of these things that we know who the vulnerable people are and that they are going to be made for the vulnerable. There's also a personal reason. I became an environmentalist when I was 15. I started I think the first job I ever had was NIPERG. I don't know if any of you remember the PERGs, like the public interest research groups. We had to go door to door canvassing. I was 16 years old, you know? So I've been an environmentalist my entire life. This term, eco-anxiety, came to be and was created by one of our collaborators, Susan Clayton, in 2017. There has been no word for what we're feeling. There has been no word for Indigenous communities of the grief and the trauma they're experiencing, seeing the land change, seeing their kin, our non-human kin, disappear, right, and be harmed. And it is amazing to me that we finally have the language to explain what's been happening to us all this time. For those of you who are interested, this is Wounded Deer by Frida Kahlo. It's really, I think, captures what so many of us feel, which is that we identify, the reason why we become environmentalists is because we identify with something out there. Whether it is out in nature, whether it is the earth herself, whether it is a species we love, a place we went fishing with our dads, right? There is something that kind of triggered our interest in the non-human life out there. And when that larger, right, range of identity is harmed, we feel pain. That is essentially at the heart of what eco-anxiety is, what climate distress is, and what solastalgia is. So I think this is a good place for me to hand it to you. Oh, sorry, yeah, I should have explained. Are you going to talk about it?
Yeah. Hey, good morning. I'm really grateful to be here with you all. It's really nice to do this in like a sunny breakfast setting. So my name is Christy, and I am a research assistant professor at the Center for Healthy Minds at University of Wisconsin-Madison. My background and training is in psychological science, and more specifically in affective science. So I've been studying emotions for a number of years now, and I feel really grateful to work at a center with the mission to cultivate well-being and relieve suffering through a scientific understanding of the mind, with the vision of a kinder, wiser, more compassionate world. And one thing that's really unique about this center is just that I love is just how multidisciplinary it is. So the Loka Initiative is also housed at the Center for Healthy Minds. My desk is like 20 feet away from Dekila's. And so we got to talking and one day, and we just realized the opportunity to really integrate our expertise. So my sort of experiences and expertise in affective science with Dekila's experiences and expertise as an environmental professional and leader, to really address a significant gap in research. So as this quote says, thus far most research and communications on the impacts of climate change have emphasized the physical health effects, while mental health has been secondary. And we're now seeing quite rigorous, large-scale survey studies relevant to mental health that are showing that threats to mental health and well-being are widespread and increasing. And so the American Psychological Association does a survey regularly called Stress in America, and they recently reported that 55% of Americans find climate change to be a significant source of stress. And a recent international survey study of 10,000 children and young adults across the world, ages 16 to 25, reported that 84% of them reported at least being moderately worried about climate change. 59%, so almost 60%, reported being very or extremely worried, and that 45% reported an impact on their daily functioning, so a negative impact on their daily activities, eating, going to school, sleeping, hanging with their friends. So really that it was impacting them on a day-to-day basis. So these numbers are pretty staggering. And of course, it's always really important to point out, as Dekila shared too, that the burdens of climate change fall more heavily on some groups due to historical and current injustices. So Dekila mentioned some of these groups, and you can see on this figure here as well. And these groups are made more vulnerable to the mental health impacts of climate change, and also typically have less access to resources to support their mental health. So as Dekila said, they're put in a position to be more resilient, which is extremely unjust and unfair. So when we think about research, we think about research being grounded in climate justice. And so I just wanted to share one of the key principles that we think about, which is called procedural rights. So procedural rights is that opportunities are afforded to the people most affected by climate change to participate meaningfully in development and implementation of responses to the climate crisis. And so we also think about this in terms of how we think about building resilience and supporting people's mental health, that we need to do that for and with the people that we want to be impacted by the research. And so I wanted to, before getting a little bit, Dekila mentioned the research that we are starting to get up and going, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about that. Before I do that, I wanted to share some really recent research on experiences of burnout in climate and environmental workforce, which may be relevant to some of you in this room. And one of the things that was really striking to Dekila and I when we were going through the literature is just how little research has been done with environmental professionals, environmentalists, those working in climate environmental sector. And so it was really wonderful actually to see this report. And I think one of the things about this report, so this is focused on qualitative research. So when we think about burnout, we often think about mental fatigue, exhaustion, but the research that they did really showed us much more kind of depth and complexity around these experiences that I think are really important. So people feeling physical pain and discomfort, all of the feelings that come along with burnout, shame, failure, and guilt at feeling burnout, feeling lonely and isolated, feeling indifferent, apathetic, hopeless, feeling grief and anxiety, feeling powerless and demoralized. And what this also showed is that even though people are having these very distressing feelings of burnout, they don't leave. So people stay because the work is really urgently needed. Another major takeaway of this report is that, another major takeaway of this report is that the experience of burnout is really compounded by identity. And so for Black, Indigenous, and people of color, and especially Black participants in this research, burnout was exacerbated from working in performative, white-dominated spaces. So, sharing their experiences of their voices being tokenized, being burdened with the demands of representing frontline communities, and having to experience funders deprioritize environmental issues of immediate concern to communities of color, to their communities. And the last takeaway from this report is that the resources for coping, so many people are experiencing burnout, and the resources for coping are sporadic, insufficient, and in some cases underutilized. So people are often turning to informal networks to relate, identify, and heal together. So this report is from the nonprofit Climate Critical. It's freely available, so if you're interested, you can find it on the internet. This is just a few snapshots. It's an amazing report. I highly recommend reading the whole thing. And this, so Tamara Toles-O'Loughlin is the founder and CEO of Climate Critical, and this is a quote that she provided, sort of capturing moving forward with this research. So it's time for deep and durable investments in whole people and whole solutions for the whole planet. And so this focus on whole people really resonates with the research that Dekila and I are starting to do. And so our first research priority is really about us understanding emotional journeys. So Dekila shared a little bit of her emotional journey a few minutes ago. And so for us, focusing on those most impacted and burdened by the climate crisis and environmental degradation, what is the nature of people's emotional journeys? Understanding the distressing emotional experiences, and also experiences of resilience and healing, right? People also have a lot of wisdom to share. And then how do these journeys differ across people, right? So, we're obviously people have different journeys. So how do we think about how they have been impacted by climate change, how they've been impacted by climate change, how their identity and how their relationships and communities shape their journeys. And so I'm just gonna put a bunch of emotion words up here. Maybe some of these resonate with you, maybe you felt them in these contexts, and maybe you haven't felt some of them. So the idea is that we really wanna understand the emotions that people are experiencing in context, the variety of emotions one person may be experiencing on their emotional journey, and then understanding how different people's emotional journeys are similar and different. And as I mentioned, we also really want to understand emotions that seem to be supportive and promoting resilience. And so we're in crisis, right? We're going to have distress. But what are the emotions that help us transform that distress, that help us decrease that distress in its intensity and frequency, and just having a more full and kind of more variety of emotions overall that help us be resilient in this situation. And so that brings me to our second research priority that we're thinking a lot about, and this is learning from those emotional journeys, how to think about nurturing emotional resilience. So again, focusing on those most impacted and burdened by climate change and environmental degradation. What are the psychological skills that nurture emotional resilience, that nurture this inner resilience that Dekila talked about? And the skills that help us navigate climate and ecological distress, the skills that help us embrace the momentary joys and cultivate other life-giving emotions. And again, in context. So understanding that, not all skills are gonna be relevant for all people in all situations. And so understanding what makes sense for a person based on their identity, based on the place, based on the situation. And also in community, so thinking about doing inner work in community, and the power of that when you feel interconnected with others, when you're learning, when you're doing inner work, when you're learning these skills, feeling held and seen in community, in a place where you're both receiving and giving. And so we think that is a really important part of this, is not only kind of identifying these skills, but how we learn these skills, and how we sort of connect with others around this. And so I like to think that the research that we are designing and working on addresses what Britt Ray, who's the author of the recent book Generation Dread, describes here as the task at hand, which is to create new norms around how we handle and harness psychotraumatic emotions for the sake of our health, well-being, and collective survival. And so we promised we'd come back to solastalgia, so here we are. So I think a part of this, I showed you many emotion words in former slides, but a part of this is thinking about having a language for what we're experiencing, specifically in this context, so the emotions that are arising related to our experiences of climate change and environmental crises. And so there are many words emerging right now. So as Glenn Albrecht wrote in his book, these are new words for a new world. So how many of you have heard of eco-anxiety? Okay, so a good number. And of course, these words can mean slightly different things to different people. One way this has been defined is as chronic fear of environmental doom. How many have heard of solastalgia? Okay, so fewer people. So solastalgia is a word for the distress caused by the unwelcome transformation of cherished landscapes, resulting in cumulative mental, emotional, and spiritual health impacts. So really being grounded in place and the distress that causes. And then the third is ecological grief. How many people have heard of ecological grief? Okay. So ecological grief has been defined as the grief felt in relation to experienced and anticipated ecological losses, including losses of species, ecosystems, and meaningful landscapes. And so these are just a couple of the words that are emerging in this space. And the idea is that having these words can be really helpful for working with our emotions. So this is a place where it's really interesting to see the intersections with work and research in affective science. And so we know from research in affective science that putting our feelings into words can reduce kind of the initial surge of reactivity that we often feel with these distressing emotions. So it's sort of a foothold to then working with our emotions. And that naming emotions also helps us start to develop more fine-grained distinctions in what we're feeling, which has been referred to as emotional granularity. So I put up many different emotions on the slides a few minutes ago. And so we can think about becoming more granular, understanding, not just that we're feeling bad, but we're feeling anger, we're feeling grief, we're feeling sadness. And one place, the thinking around emotional granularity and what the evidence shows is that developing granularity, so becoming more granular about the emotions you're experiencing, can be really helpful in choosing a coping strategy that really meets the moment, right? And so there's many ways we can cope with our emotions. Maybe we take a walk outside, maybe we do a meditation, maybe we just need to take a nap. And so becoming more granular about what you're experiencing then allows you to start to kind of try out different coping strategies and figure out what works and what works best when you're in that particular emotional state. And then I just want to end with contemplative practices. So Dekila already talked about this a little bit, and she's going to come back to this and tell you about the wide variety of contemplative practices there are and actually offer one so you can try it out. But the way we sort of define scientifically a contemplative practice is as a form of training that emphasizes self-awareness, self-regulation, and or self-inquiry to enact a process of psychological transformation. So you may be most familiar maybe with meditation and mindfulness, but as Dekila is going to show you in a few minutes, there's a wide variety of contemplative practices that we can think about. And in the course that we're designing, there's a wide variety of contemplative practices that will be offered. Again, with the idea behind the course is to start to become more granular about your emotions, to be able to try out these different techniques and exercise and figure out what works for you. And so research suggests that there are many psychological benefits of contemplative practice. This is a very active area of research in psychological science. And so again, there are many different types of contemplative practice, and so some of the things that we see in the research are showing that practices are developing awareness and attentional focus. Some practices focus on cultivating qualities like compassion. Some practices focus on building insight into ourselves and how our minds and emotions are working. But we really don't know a lot, so there's very little research on how and for whom different practices may be helpful, especially in this context of nurturing resilience in the face of climate and ecological distress. So that's one thing that we're really hoping to figure out. And as Dekila said, and she'll tell you more about, we are launching a course soon, and there will be research that you can opt into as part of that course if you're interested. So I will hand things back to her to offer a little space for emotions today and a contemplative practice, which will just be like a little taster of the course.
What's been really interesting is we have a subset of professional climate and environmentalists who just are very uncomfortable with any of these practices. So I've started putting in committing to individual behavior change and committing to community-based action as part of the exercise, so that they also feel like they are part of the group as we are going through these different practices. So some of the practices that the course is offering, some of the practices that we are testing out right now with our research, the first one that seems to be really helpful is called Tonglen. This comes from the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, which is my tradition. I offer it very often. There was a Tibetan Buddhist leader, His Holiness the Karmapa, who's kind of number 2 to the Dalai Lama, who actually tweaked it for environmentalists, and the translation for it is giving and receiving. So a lot of the time, this practice is actually created for people when you have a lot of hatred for someone, or you really despise somebody. The practice is meant for you to work through that emotion, and you visualize that person in front of you, and you take in their suffering, and you offer your love and compassion, right? So you give and you receive. But this practice, the way it's been tweaked, it really is to work with the earth, or an ecosystem, or a species, or a community that you care about. And what you visualize and what you're doing with your breathing exercise is you're breathing in their suffering and you're breathing out compassion. So this is that practice. Forest bathing, probably many of you know of it. I see it in the news a lot. This comes from the Japanese tradition, Shinrokyu. And this is really spending time in nature. Easiest hack for our eco-anxiety and our climate distress is go spend time, create a nature sit spot, which just essentially means find a spot that feels natural to you, right? Find a spot where you feel safe and you are able to see non-human life, where you're able to see trees and plants. If you don't have access to that, not everybody does, of course. Creating a space in your living quarters, like getting a plant or two. The idea is what you are doing is allowing yourself to be bathed by nature. You're allowing yourself to immerse in nature, and you're just allowing nature to be present in your consciousness. Land-based healing is a practice that Indigenous peoples do all around the world. This is specifically for Indigenous peoples. This is a practice because of our worldview and our spiritual system and our spiritual belief that land is alive and nature is alive. So this is specifically for the Indigenous people in the room. Somatics, again. So somatics is a practice that has some research now, really interesting research that's backing it, which is essentially using movement to counter or to regulate your emotions. So there are all kinds of movements that you can do, and I wish I had time to go through all of them and demonstrate. We also see a really interesting subset of population that respond to prayer. What has been really interesting is to see how gratitude in particular is linked to prayer. So for people who really like to pray, right, who come from Judeo-Christian traditions, who come from traditions where prayer is a big part of their everyday ritual, we really emphasize this. Contemplative prayer is slightly different, where you pray, but you're also contemplating and doing some mindfulness, and it's more integrated with also observation of your thoughts. So that is another kind of prayer. And finally, the last two, like I mentioned. As you go through your day, as you go through your week, every time you feel overwhelmed and all the emotions that Christy listed come up and that you listed come up, just take a moment to do this breathing where you feel connected, right? Like I said, there is no point where we are not interdependent with nature, because there is no point that we can distinguish in ourselves and say the oxygen starts here, tequila stops there, right? Oxygen stops there, tequila starts here. We would not be alive without nature. We are part of it. She is part of us.
Well, thank you, everyone. Can you join me in thanking our speakers this week?